Well, I'm super excited because I've really jam-packed, like I love to, jam-packed a lot of information into a short, concise period of time. And hopefully giving you just a ton of information to run with. And then for those of you who want more information on this sort of stuff, we have our fall quarter launching in just a few days. It does start October 1st, but you can join at any time. But we have our fall quarter with 2 courses. One is the shoulder module, really looking at more of that anatomy and mechanics and orthopedic issues there. And then the second course is our Yin Meditation, which is what has inspired this short free webinar to give you a little bit of free information and then a resource if you want more. But I am going to pack a lot into this, so you'll have some stuff to play with, and then when and if you want more, the course is there. And you don't have to join us right on October 1st if you want to wait. We will have it some live Q&As every 2 weeks to guide you through the process for those of you who want to do it over the span of the quarter. But the recordings are there for you anytime. You can go back and watch it later. You can do it at your own pace. So there's really no rush. We'll move onwards to talk about some of the stretching research. So again, I think stretching research is some of the most confusing research out there because there is so much of it, and you can find research literally to support any theory you have almost as it relates to stretching. It's often very conflicting, and so it can be really difficult to really pinpoint exactly what is best when. However, there have been some interesting studies as of late, and you can see as we go through the references here. The main one here is at the bottom, but you can see one of these here, this one, the one at the bottom that you see, was looking at the duration and the importance of the durations. But let me back up before I get to that one. I will say the one thing that we see over and over in the research, actually, let me make sure that no one's saying they can't hear me. It's always the worst when you start recording and no one can hear you. But what's interesting about the stretching research is that really all of these different types of stretching that we look at in the research, whether it's active static stretching, passive static stretching, which would be more of a yin practice, ballistic, where there's some movement involved, or PNF, where I'm using some resistance to get in there. Again, you don't need to worry about the specifics, but all these different types of stretching do show some range of motion improvements. So the question is, how much, how long do the effects last? How much do I need to do? And how long do I need to do it for? How often? So there's a lot of moving parts, and then how to do it. And we're going to talk about this, but know that there is always some gray area in the research. Nothing, especially when there's so many moving parts, is ever completely definitive. But one thing that you will see in the research is that static stretching usually shows the greatest gains compared to the other types of stretching. And so it is fairly agreed upon that the static stretching is the best way to go for range of motion improvements. Now, keep in mind that not everyone needs range of motion improvements. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And maybe that's probably a lot longer topic for us to discuss. But in yoga, we tend to always want more and more range of motion, and there is a healthy balance there. So these are talking about populations that have limited range of motion. And so static stretching is usually shows the greatest gains in range of motion over time. And this study in particular, this review, what this review said from their analysis of the stretching research, which, as you can imagine, since there's so much stretching research, reviews can be really helpful, was that 5 days a week was the most important marker for improvements in range of motion, that you only needed 5 minutes per week, but that it was really important that it had to be done 5 times a week. So 5 times a week for a minimum of 1 minute per muscle group, per an area that you're working on. So if I was just working on, let's just say hamstrings, just to pick one, I would want to find all I would need, again, this is the minimum, would be 1 stretch targeting those hamstrings for at least 1 minute, 5 times a week. So the frequency really is more important than the duration when we're talking about range of motion. Now, we're going to talk about other things that yin yoga can do, but this is kind of the most famous byproduct of a yin yoga practice is the range of motion improvements there. So more recent research has also looked at the duration too, because there's, in the past, up until just recently, static stretching was really avoided prior to athletic endeavors, prior to, training or sport, or maybe even potentially a yoga practice. But more recent evidence suggests that it might be a little bit more specific than that. So what they found, and again, I'll have the link at the bottom once I go through these whole slides here, was that less than 60 seconds was what was important as part of a warm-up routine. So they recommended just less than 60 seconds. Again, this is per muscle group. So if I'm doing those hamstrings in a forward bend, that I'm staying less than 60 seconds as part of my warm-up, that I'm also, as I start to stay more than 60 seconds, that's really when I start to see the declines in strength and power, what is often referred to in the research as performance declines or deficits, which is really why stretching has been avoided, or static stretching has been avoided prior to training sessions in the past. And there's still a lot of fear around that in the sports world, but that it is starting to change now with some of this new research that's come out. But what the research is showing us now is that it's really about how long you stay. So if I'm using it as a warm-up routine, I want to go less than 60 seconds per an area. But the other thing that they found was that for recreational athletes, the performance deficits were very minor, and it wasn't really important as someone who's competing at a very high level, like a professional athlete. So for recreational athletes, they're recommending this short duration stretching as part of a warm-up, because the warm-up will also mediate some of those performance declines or neutralize some of those performance declines in their warm-up after it. So I do the static stretching and then I have my warm-up. Versus high performance athletes, they are still using it with caution because, especially with professional athletes, there's still a lot that we don't know. So here's the link to the study there, which was very current. Oh, did it get cut off? Sorry, the reference was cut off there. It is CHAABENE et al. 2019. So I had your Thomas et al. 2018 here. And for some reason that one got cut off. But if you just search that title, you will find it. So it's a 2019 article, so it is very current there as well. Let's see here, let me come back. All right, so another really interesting thing here to consider is it the fascia or the muscle stretching? And there, again, has been some really interesting recent research. Carlos Stecco, one of my favorite scientists that I like to follow, wrote a narrative review, which was a really interesting review of really looking at some of the research that's been done at what is actually stretching. And again, with research, there's always more to be done. These are all just kind of some suggestions that we're starting to see, but the research is starting to suggest that these non-muscular structures are playing a very important role, not only in flexibility, my ability to stretch, my perception of stretch, but also potential limitations to that stretch as well. What they've found too is that during this passive static stretching, which is what we're doing in a yin practice, that the deep fascia is the first to limit elongation. So for those of you who studied fascia with me before in some of our courses, the deep fascia is what creates those myofascial chains, or what Tom Myers calls the anatomy trains, versus the superficial fascia, which is that layer right underneath the skin, between the skin and the muscle there. So during this static stretching, this passive static stretching, the deep fascia is the first to limit our range of motion, is the first thing to show up. So fascia is probably a really big part of the targets of a passive static stretching routine. So I think this little rubber band analogy kind of helps to consider this. Imagine your tendons. They're much stronger, denser, fibrous connective tissue. They're also made of connective tissue. And then the fascia, the deep fascia that encases and goes through the muscular layers there, is like a really thin, kind of flimsy rubber band. And we're just kind of getting an idea of how these work together in a stretch. We've got that really dense fibrous tissue of the tendon, and then a less dense version of that, like a saran wrap around the muscle that actually goes through the muscle too. So you can kind of imagine now that layer that goes around and through the muscle turns into that tendon, that really thick, fibrous, tendinous material. So you can think of it like a really stiff rubber band or a thicker rubber band attached to a very thin, flimsy rubber band. The thick rubber band is going to represent the tendon, that strong, fibrous material of the tendon, versus the deep fascia around the muscle, which is really what we're probably targeting more in a yin practice. And you can just see here, you could do this experiment on your own too. It's very difficult to arrange. Took me a long time to find the rubber bands in my drawer. But really what we're looking at here, let me hold it up in the light here, is that as I lengthen, watch the length change in the blue rubber band versus the deep fascia. So the tendon is the blue and this is the deep fascia. As I start to lengthen here, you can see that primarily what's changing in length is this deep fascia, this thinner rubber band versus the thicker rubber band of the tendon doesn't change much at all. Now, obviously this isn't exactly the same continuum of a fascia and a muscle, it's a rubber band, but it gives you a good kind of comparison there to understand that really what we're targeting, the newer idea now is that what we're targeting with this passive static stretching, imagine you had a muscle contract within that deep fascia, it'll change things a little bit as well. But in this passive static stretching, probably our main target is that deep fascial layer that surrounds the muscle, or these kind of anatomy trains as Tom Myers shows in his book. So there's very little stretch in the tendon. You can really, some people will talk about it as the deep fascia really swallowing the stretch here because the muscles are relaxed. If you look at this in a cadaver, you really see this well, that the muscle is just this plump contractile tissue that just sits in the casing of the fascia. So as we do these passive stretches, we're relaxing the muscle so that we can really target that connective tissue around it. And then this was a really interesting review that came out, and meta-analysis that came out in 2019. And it kind of sparked a lot of interest in the sports medicine world, because usually when we look at a muscle strain injury, what we think of is an injury to the muscle itself. And Jan Wilkie did a really great study looking at where these injuries are actually happening potentially, and found that most of the time, you can see 68% of the time, oops, my thing back here, 68% of the time was happening in the musculotendinous junction. So that's right in between the muscle and the tendon. So really in that connective tissue. And then the 32%, that's in the fascia around the muscles, versus only 12% were actually in the muscular, the muscle itself, the muscle tissue. So it's actually pretty uncommon or less common. And this was a well done research study, review that included 16 different studies. So that gives us a little bit more information too, to really see that potentially these injuries that we think of as muscle injuries are also potentially happening in the fascia. So my reason for including this is that the fascia is such an important part of our musculoskeletal system that is definitely getting more attention, especially in the yoga world, but has historically been under-acknowledged for its capacity, both in pain and injury and performance as well. So Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of experimental studies suggest that the fascia, or some experimental studies suggest that the fascial tissue has a higher pain sensitivity than the muscle itself. So also potentially maybe more important when we're talking about working with pain. And as it relates to DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness, it's also thought now to be more from the fascia than from the muscle as well. So there's a lot of interesting implications within the fascia, which makes our focus in a yin practice, now that we're seeing, okay, probably most of what we're influencing in a yin practice is the fascia. Fascia is very important for pain and injury and performance and health. So let's take a little bit deeper look at kind of how this happens and some of the qualities of the tissues, especially the fascial tissues here. So first off, I just want to say that, stiffness and range of motion limitations tend to get a bad rap. This was what I was mentioning before. And it is really important that we appreciate that stiffness isn't a bad thing, especially as an athlete. If you're athletic or even just want to be able to move efficiently when you do, our fascial system can transmit force much more effectively and efficiently when it has some stiffness to it. So when we lose some of the stiffness, we have lost energy in the system's capacity to really be economical. So think about this as again, like a flimsy rubber band versus a nice stiff rubber band, and its capacity to transmit energy through the system is much easier with a little bit of that stiffness than if there were kind of a slack sense within that system. So I just put these in here for your reference, but stiffness is really a ratio of stress to strain, which you don't need to ruminate on those, but really the resistance to the tissue's capacity to deform. And compliance, which is what we often think of as flexibility, is the opposite of that stiffness. So what's important, again, that I've mentioned kind of already, but stiffer CT is connective tissue, stiffer connective tissue. So this connective tissue, I actually haven't mentioned already, but remember, connective tissue, if you're not familiar with it, includes a lot of things. It includes the fascia around the muscles, through the muscles, under the skin. It includes the tendons and ligaments. It even includes the cartilage and the bone. So, but when we're talking about it here, this stiffer fascial system really creates a more rapid rebound when the load is removed. So think about your gait cycle as you, or maybe going to the gym and lifting weights. As I remove the load, my connective tissue can bounce back into its original position much more quickly. Kind of like this rubber band. If I take this slack rubber band, it actually rebounds a lot slower than if I stretch this really firm, thick rubber band. It goes really fast to rebound back to its original shape. So that stiffness allows us to conduct energy, and it implies less lost energy in the system. So not only is it more efficient, it's also more economical for an athlete. And really each sport has a different balance of stiffness versus compliance, because we know that these are now opposites. So I want to have that perfect balance depending on what is needed. And whether you're athletic or not, the sport of your life is a sport, or maybe competitive. But keep in mind that flexibility isn't just about this tissue compliance. There's also a lot of neurologic inputs that are also influencing that. So there is more to the conversation than just that. But this is part of it. So when we talk about those performance deficits that I mentioned before, it's helpful to understand some of the features of this fascial system, which is a viscoelastic tissue. Because it's viscoelastic, and if you're not familiar with this term viscoelastic, it means it has both viscosity and elasticity. So when we look at viscoelastic tissues, what's important to remember is that there is a kind of a slower change over time when we stretch them. So think about like this rubber band would be a really great example of elasticity, because its capacity to return to its original form is very quick There's no lost energy in the system versus a viscoelastic tissue. You could imagine more like a gummy bear. If you were to take a gummy bear and stretch it, but don't break it. You take a gummy bear and stretch it, it's going to instantly stretch right away. But if I hold it at that same place, it's going to continue to deform under that same amount of load. Then if I let go of it, it's also going to take a while to go back to its original shape. Unlike the rubber band, I stretch it, it immediately stretches. I let go, it immediately goes back. So with these viscoelastic tissues that we see in the fascia itself as well, fascia is a form of this, we see a couple of things that are really important to keep in mind. One, I'm going to skip to the second one here, is this idea of creep. And creep is what happens when the fascia is loaded and then held over time. There's this progressive deformation. So I mentioned as I stretch the gummy bear, it initially stretches, but then as I just hold that, it's also elongating over time in response to that constant load, which is different than a rubber band. I stretch it and it's just there. So there's a progressive deformation. And imagine yourself as I'm describing this in a yin posture. Obviously, our fascia is not exactly like gummy bears, but you can imagine that creep effect that maybe you've experienced in a yin practice as the tissues start to adapt and maybe ease into the stretch as you relax there. Stress relaxation is another example of this, but basically it's looking at a decrease in resistance to that deformation. So again, my tissue's resistance to that load is also going down over time in a passive stretch. So again, kind of you're in a yin posture, you're staying there, and all of a sudden you kind of feel like yourself softening into the stretch a little bit more. That is due to these viscoelastic properties here. Now, hysteresis is an interesting one because this implies that lost energy. So again, the gummy bear, I have the load, it continues to deform in response to that constant load. So we've got the creep and stress relaxation. But when I let go of it, hysteresis is that lag time of it returning back to its original shape. And this is important because it implies lost energy in the system. So, and this is kind of a big part of what we're talking about with the implications for performance deficits in a yin practice, which if you haven't heard about already, they're very widely talked about in the sports realm and with athletes. And I mentioned them a little bit at the beginning of the webinar. But it's an important thing to keep in mind because with a yin practice, especially when we're holding these poses for a lot more than a minute, usually, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, there is going to be some implications and some effects on performance. Now, if I'm doing it at the beginning of a vinyasa practice, it's not going to probably be enough to really be significant. It might be enough to provide a little bit of a challenge. You might go into some of those strength poses and find it a little harder at first. I know I like doing this sometimes in a practice, going to the floor and in the middle of a flow and having some sort of fold or stretch, and then coming right back up into some challenge for the tissues. But remember, the performance deficits are pretty small and mostly important when we're talking about high level athletes. So power and strength deficits with when an athlete's going out and performing at their 100% level. So important to keep in mind whether you decide you want to teach it at the beginning of a vinyasa practice or not. You may want to experiment and decide for yourself whether you like that. But the performance deficits are there. They're small. How long they last depends a lot on what you do after. And there's a lot of variances in this in the literature. How long those last, you can imagine if I go out and, just lightly jog or do some dynamic stretching or warm up of some sort, I am going to be influencing that viscoelasticity or viscosity of the tissues just through movement. So in my first slide, I mentioned that when you're doing static stretching prior to athletic endeavors or yoga practices, active yoga practices, or maybe like on the Yoga Medicine online platform, we do yoga conditioning that really challenges the tissues, that it might be really helpful to do some sort of dynamic warm up after that static stretching as a segue into that greater challenge, which could be something simple like some sun salutes or going for a little jog or starting out with a light jog before you progress to your sprinting. So it really depends how long those effects last. The influence on performance does depend on what you do after. I personally, though, if I'm doing a yin practice, especially, a full length, half hour, hour and a half, even maybe, I personally just keep it well away from my other athletic endeavors. So at the end of the day is usually a really nice time anyways. So we see kind of some of the implications around those performance deficits, which are important to keep in mind. Again, this hysteresis or this creep, all of these viscoelastic changes are wearing off after a static stretching session. So those performance deficits are temporary as well. So let's talk about some other really interesting research or research that I think is really interesting as it relates to a yin practice. Again, some of this research is a little bit more in its earlier phases. A lot of this is in vitro studies or animal studies that have yet to be replicated on humans. But for me, I consider this to be really important and helpful information, because if we wait until all the human studies come about, we probably won't know the details of this for maybe 10 years or so. So for me, it's enough to begin experimenting and really interesting research. With this study, oops, just lost my screen there. Come back, there we go. This study was looking at stretching the loose connective tissue, which is kind of right underneath the skin, between the skin and the deep fascia, and its effect on TGF-beta1, which is an anti-inflammatory marker within the body. Don't worry too much about the specifics of that, but that was the marker that they used to look at this anti-inflammatory effect. And what they saw was when they were stretching the loose connective tissue, they actually just measured it 3 days later. So they were stretching for 10 minutes, which is quite a bit. That stretching for 10 minutes, they just stretched it once. And then they measured this TGF-beta1 3 days later and found that there was this anti-inflammatory effect 3 days after. So again, there's still a lot of missing pieces of information here about the details of how this translates into a practice. But what's interesting about this is that usually in the stretching literature, when they look at TGF-beta, they find that it increases after static stretching because they're looking at it right after. And so there tends to be this kind of stirring up, and this is my translation here, but this kind of stirring up of this inflammatory response as a way to help regulate inflammation in the long term. So the short term is now calling in those immune cells to kind of create a little bit of an inflammatory effect that ends up now regulating this response a little bit better and having an anti-inflammatory effect 3 days down the road. And we don't know, is that happening earlier than 3 days or when is that exactly starting? But what they looked at was 3 days. So important implications, I think, as an anti-inflammatory effect, not instantly, but over time. Another one here, another thing they looked at was the procollagen. Procollagen 1 is the new collagen that's formed, that's kind of just recently been formed in the body. So they use this experiment to induce a little tiny injury, a micro injury in the tissues, and then stretch the tissues daily to help. The idea was to see if it would help prevent adhesions. And what's really interesting about this one was that there was no difference between the injured and non-injured tissues that have been stretched. So the injured tissues that have been stretched and the non-injured tissues, there was no difference between them. So with that, we kind of start to see that the yin practice might potentially have some anti-inflammatory effects or anti-fibrosis. So fibrosis is this accumulation of fibrous tissue, and you can think of this like adhesions between the muscles that limits their capacity to go through their range of motion. Some people might call that scar tissue. Fibrosis is just an excess deposition of this collagen fibrous tissue, which ends up binding down the tissues and limiting their range of motion potentially. So, what we're starting to see is that as we start to tug on this connective tissue matrix, what happens is the fibroblasts, these little, the hard workers within the connective tissue, these hardworking cells, are helping to regulate both the water contents of the tissues as well as the size of the fibroblasts. And then we also see some anti-inflammatory effects happening and some regulation of that fibrosis. So some important effects on inflammation, fibrosis, immune system. Well, one thing that was interesting here as a side note too, is that there was no effect when they just lifted the leg in one direction. So they talk about this, the importance here being pulling the tissues in two directions. So my translation of this to the yoga world, there's not been direct research on this specifically, because most of these are still in vitro studies, is looking at Supta Padangusthasana, which is potentially pulling on the tissues more in one direction, versus something like Paschimottanasana, where we start to get that lengthening, or shoulder stand, where we start to get a little bit of lengthening in two directions. There's still a lot to be decided on that, so don't let that confuse you too much. But remember that this tugging on the tissues is having an effect on the connective tissue, and I'll summarize that a little bit in a minute too. Another interesting thing here that is probably we know even less about is this response that's happening within the connective tissues where we see ATP. That kind of, if you're not familiar with what ATP is kind of like the energy currency in the body. And in this case, it's kind of acting as a communication mechanism, that this ATP is kind of a signaling system that activates changes within the fibroblasts and the connective tissue in response to these static stretches. So these static stretches are instigating some sort of signaling and communication, but both through ATP and between those fibroblasts as well. And again, we still don't really understand exactly what the implications are of that, or I haven't wrapped my head around it yet. Maybe there's a scientist out there who has. Probably Helen Longavine has some ideas. This was her study, and she's done so much great research on stretching as well as acupuncture, which is another reason I love her, and connective tissue research. So she's a great one to maybe throw into your Google Scholar searches and dig around and see what she's been up to. So we have implications in a yin practice for inflammation and fibrosis. Keep in mind that these are often being held for more like 10 to 30 minutes. So again, we still have a lot to learn here about exactly when that's starting to happen, but I think we have enough information to consider that maybe these are probably things that could be part of our practice. And if you pair that together with your experience of what feels helpful, I think we can learn a lot just from that. But we don't yet have all the details. So we have to experiment safely and see always, most importantly, even when we have concrete research, is to see what works for that person, because every person is different. There's no study. I mean, it's hard to say never, but there's no study where everyone responds to a medication or therapeutic modality. There's always exceptions, and this is the humanness, the individuality. And so we still have to experiment and see what's helpful. Now, keep in mind too, that there's a whole lot of other things going on in the system. We have maybe we talk about in the yin training more about the meridians and the energetics and this Chinese medicine influence within the system potentially as well. Again, even less we can pin down in the research on our understanding of what and how and why things are happening there, but a very significant system that we've had experience of for many decades, for many, many years. And so for me, that lends some really significant information to us. So let's talk about some of the takeaways. Just in general, think about this in a yin practice. We can influence these tissues, and we're talking just about the tissue stimulus or the connective tissue. We said the fascia around the muscles is our main target. So we can stress these fibers in one of three ways, and think consider now, we tend to have stress as a negative implication here. When I'm talking about stress, I'm talking about a healthy stress. We're loading those fibers here and stimulating some change here in one of three ways. So I can lengthen them as I would in a yin practice, as maybe I would in a forward fold to my hamstrings. I can also compress them. Think about sitting on your heels and now compressing the hamstrings and the calves there. I can also apply some shearing or twisting force. You see this in the twisting poses in particular. And the idea here that we're looking at is that when I apply this stimulus, this healthy stressor to the fibers, it's communicating with those cells, the fibroblasts potentially, and stimulating reorganization of this collagen matrix. So influencing those crosslinks or fibrosis, potentially influencing that water regulation I mentioned with the fibroblasts. And this is happening, keep in mind, this is happening very slowly over time. So what we're doing now is having a conversation with those fibroblasts. And I always like to describe them as like little slugs slowly making their way through your fascial matrix and leaving collagen in their wake. So that idea of a slug really implies that they're going slowly and they're listening to anything pulling on that collagen matrix because it's attached to the collagen matrix. So if I'm a fibroblast and I'm holding onto the collagen fibers and they stretch, all of a sudden now my fibroblasts are expanding and changing in shape as well. And now listening to and interpreting that information, which is influencing how quickly they either break down collagen or create new collagen to help reorganize this collagen matrix, which is a really important part of the health of this fascial system. So to summarize here, our yin practice can potentially influence a lot of different things. The hydration of the tissues is one, and this is one that's kind of sometimes debated in the yoga world. Again, a lot of the studies here are more in vitro, where they look at taking these tissues out of the body, stretching them, again, for usually long periods of time, 10 or 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, and then releasing that stretch. And what they find is that the hydration of those tissues declines immediately in the stretch. And as they let go of the stretch over the period of 3 hours after, the hydration, the water content of those tissues continues to go up. So again, that's an in vitro implication. This one here at the bottom is a really interesting one for those of you interested in hydration effects in connective tissue. Yoshimura this year, and they were looking at it in humans, looking at foam rolling and measuring impedance, so the resistance to electrical currents, to measure hydration in the tissues, and found some positive effects of foam rolling and MFR. And so it's different, obviously, with foam rolling, but it's kind of this similar idea that the connective tissue matrix is like a spongy matrix. So as I stretch it, it pushes water out of that sponge. And as I release that stretch, that sponge starts to soak up more of the nearby fluids, of the surrounding fluids, and incorporate that into its matrix over a period of maybe several hours. And myofascial release potentially having a similar effect as well. So yin potentially influencing the hydration of the tissues. This is really important for tissue resilience. It also acts as kind of a pressurization to the joints because we know water is resistant to compression. It also influences that organization of the collagen matrix we just talked about. We talked about it influencing crosslinks and fibrosis, inflammation and immune regulation around that. And then think about it just influencing this whole tension distributing system. Rather than thinking about stretching one part, consider that every piece of connective tissue in your body is connected and creates more of a tension distributing system. So I can adjust this tension distributing system or a tensegrity system to find maybe a more balanced pressure regulating system or tension regulating system. And then we also know that yin, we haven't talked about this much, but yin also potentially has a really important effect on the nervous system. There are little Ruffini endings in the fascia that are responsive to slow held pressure, like we would find in a yin practice, that respond by down-regulating that sympathetic nervous system. And that's probably one you can easily connect to, because we've all kind of felt, if you've done a yin practice, a full maybe hour, maybe even in a half an hour, as you're able to stay and relax there and be comfortable there, find a comfortable position, you've probably felt those relaxing effects afterwards. And also just becoming more comfortable with that stretch sensation is part of the range of motion effects too, which is a neurologic response. So what are some of the takeaways here as to our purpose with the yin practice? Remember, the fibroblasts are always responding to that mechanical stimulus. And so thinking of it in that context is really helpful. But also keep in mind that if I'm trying to stretch that connective tissue, that's my target tissue for all of the reasons we've talked about. The muscles have to relax in order to target the connective tissue. So one of the most important things we can do in a yin practice is find a way to get comfortable there. We tend to get so kind of obsessed with making it look like the photo or making specific shapes or angles. But really what I need to do is find a way to embody the pose in my own unique way, use my props, so that most of all, I can relax the muscle tissue in that fascial casing to be more specific to the connective tissue. I also want to apply a very gentle stress over time. So remember, stress is a good thing in this context, but we could replace that with stretch if it's easier for you, but applying a very gentle stretch over time to increase pliability. We talked about hydration, also influencing circulation, and then potentially the strength of that connective tissue system, because we're speaking to those fibroblasts that are laying down collagen here. So stimulate fibroblasts to regulate collagen production and metabolism. We talked about anti-inflammatory and anti-fibrotic effects, down-regulating the sympathetic nervous system. And then don't forget that increase in circulation, which is also important in that lymphatic flow as well. And then what I mentioned briefly is that freeing up energetic circulation, potentially influencing the meridians as well. So there's a lot of different effects we can see in a yin practice, remodeling, instigating those remodeling effects, potentially part of that being strengthening that collagen matrix, balancing this tension system, the hydration. The obvious one is the range of motion, which we started off with. Potentially also through that circulation, increasing the oxygenation of the tissues, releasing toxins, and that lymphatic system is a big part of that cleaning up of and taking away toxins or metabolic byproducts, the fibrosis or adhesions. And then I mentioned it really briefly, but as it relates to hydration, that hydration of the tissues creates some kind of a little bit of passive stability through the joints because of that pressurization that the water provides, or the fluids. And then again, kind of an obvious one, the increases in elasticity and all of the effects in the connective tissue as a means of providing resilience. So a few things to keep in mind as you're practicing, and these are kind of some that I've found in my own experience to be really helpful, some based on what we've talked about. But we really want to find a position where we can relax. So when I'm teaching a class, I'm usually picking a number somewhere in here. Sometimes it depends on the people that I'm teaching or where they're at, but usually I'm saying 60% of your capacity. A number is kind of vague, right? So if you have people who tend to push it a lot, you might say 50%. Or if you're working more on range of motion, you might say 70%, let them get in a little deeper maybe. But the idea here, 60%, 70% is relative. My translation of this is that what we're looking for here is going into the stretch slowly so that I can feel when I start to feel the stretch without getting really deep into it. So usually that point where you just start to feel some sensation or tugging in the tissues, for most people, this is before they really get deep into that stretch. We know 100% would be that edge we talk about. And a lot of times in a vinyasa practice where we might go, oftentimes it's taught to go right up to that edge. and we go beyond 100% and potentially do damage to the tissues. So I'm well within that edge. It really is a place where I can relax here that muscle contractile fiber within the fascial system so that I can really be specific and targeted to the connective tissue. But I do want to feel like a little tug there. And for some people, the connective tissue tug or stretch there can feel very different than maybe a muscular stretch. You don't need to overthink that, but really what we're looking for is that you're starting to go into the pose, and just until you start to feel that little tug through the tissues, not necessarily until you're as deep as you can go, that 100%. So I find some people respond really well to the 60% marker. For some people, that's too vague for them. So that kind of helps you understand. The next one is I just want to be still as I move around. Remember, muscles create that movement. So I really want those muscles to be relaxed so that I can target the connective tissue. Then I want to stay so that I can really leave a meaningful impact on these connective tissues. The fibroblasts are listening and responding, not just in a second, but over time. I also want to move into it with softness and respect. And that was from the slide that we talked about with the viscoelasticity of the tissues and the importance of how slower strain resists less than faster strain. So as I go in slowly to the stretch for these viscoelastic tissues, I allow them to kind of adapt to that too. Remember the gummy bear analogy. So moving with softness and respect for the tissues, I think, is an important thing as well. And then having a mindful awareness and curiosity. I'm not stretching to pain, but I'm exploring, I'm stretching gently and relaxing into it, and gradually ramping up maybe over a few seconds as the tissues relax. But I'm also listening and using prompts. So most of it's pretty straightforward and can be summarized with the 3 S's: still, stay, surrender, still, stay, surrender. But then this 50 to 70%, I think, is a really important one, because most people in a yin practice, and this is where I went wrong for a long time when it was really not helpful for me, was I would be more at that 90%, maybe even 100% that we normally do in a vinyasa practice, and staying there and then coming out and feeling like, oh, not a helpful practice. So again, another overview here. The important things to keep in mind: the 50 to 60%. The timing, it really depends on you. I find it's often better later in the day because of the parasympathetic response that we enjoy with, the later parts of the day. Also, as we're moving around, there's more circulation. So for a lot of people, the tissues are more accessible at the end of the day to come into the postures, which, are really the people we want doing this yin practice. Yin practices are great for a lot of reasons, the anti-inflammatory and other reasons. But if we're talking about range of motion, really potentially most helpful for the people who are the tightest. But now we know there's other uses too. So the length of time here, I love this one. Hopefully this changes your perception a little bit too, is a minimum of a minute. And I know I personally really love short, quick little practices. We have a few on Yoga Medicine Online that I've done where we just do 1 to 2 minute holds. I've found in my own body, especially as a quick, like, end of day recovery or post-sport recovery, that this can be really effective, even just being there for a minute. But remember that research review showed that for range of motion improvements, if that's your purpose, all you need is 1 minute 5 times a week per muscle group, right? So if you're working in a few different areas, that might be a few. And keep in mind, that's just for range of motion. And so I've heard Helen Longavine, who did a lot of the studies on the anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic effects and ATP effects, talk about, we don't really know exactly how much we need for those anti-inflammatory effects, but it's probably on the longer spectrum. Again, we don't really know yet, but that's, as someone in the research, her translation, her guess. And then also keep in mind, if you're using it pre or post sport, that if I'm using it pre-sport, I really want to stay at less than 60 seconds and then have some kind of dynamic stretching or aerobic exercise to warm up, or sport specific preparations. And if it's post-sport, I also want to keep it kind of low intensity because the muscles, I don't want to go so deep. Again, if I'm staying to that 60%, I'll be just fine, but I don't want to go right up to that 80 or 90, or even I'd probably stay more toward the 50 or 60% post sport, keep it really gentle to minimize soreness as well. And then using the breath to help relax, to help downregulate the nervous system is a really great one to keep in mind. All right, so just some quick info. That's your overview. Hopefully that gives you a lot of things to work with. Here's some of the highlights if you're interested in learning more about this Yin practice, which I love so much. There's so many great uses for it. In Chinese medicine, the implications of a Yin practice are broad. And I think in our busy modern day society, there's such an important place for the Yin practice outside of everything we've talked about in this webinar, all the physical, mechanical changes, but really as it relates to the nervous system and the energetic system and this balance of yin and yang in the body, which is so, from a Chinese medicine perspective, so vital for our health and vitality. So in the Yin and meditation training, we have the two different portions. And in the Yin portion, we talk a lot about the stretching that we've looked a little bit at in this webinar. We'll talk more about stretching and fascial research as it relates to a Yin practice. We do a little overview of the fascial anatomy and how a Yin practice can influence the fascial health, which is really important. You've got some ideas of that already. We look at when and how to apply the Yin practices. We look at joint mechanics. We also look at contraindications and things to avoid. We look at this Chinese medicine lens, look at 5 elements, meridians, acupressure, yin yang theory. And then of course we dissect all the poses and modifications. And then at the end, we talk about myofascial chains and sequencing and class creation and how to be a really efficient and effective teacher, both in a group and a one-on-one setting. Now, I haven't talked about it all in this webinar, but I did just want to mention this whole other portion of the training in case you're interested. The meditation portion looks at a lot of different things. Again, really just both of these are meant to give you all the resources you need to teach a really impactful class. But we looked at mindfulness practices and uses. We look a lot at the meditation research. Rashmi, such a great presenter. She's a board certified physician in preventative medicine with a specialty in mindfulness and meditation. And so she's such a really valuable resource. And she talks about the meditation research effects on neurotransmitters and the nervous system and the endocrine system, immune, epigenetics, and aging. In particular, she talks about the cognitive effects of meditation and neuroplasticity, the obstacles in the practice, as well as contraindications, which are important to consider. And then all of the details of leading and guiding people through meditation. And I love that she gives an overview of the spiritual paths of meditation and different styles of meditation. And again, all of the details you need to guide a practice there. So there's your code one more time if you joined late for the discount, if you want the full training. And if not, my whole purpose of this webinar was to give you some points that you can go and use right away. So you definitely can do a lot with what I've given you just in the webinar. But for those who are interested in more or are interested in teaching Yin and meditation or already teach Yin and meditation and want some deeper information to utilize within their classes, there's our discount code for you. And what you'll see in our training, it's like a lot of our other trainings, if you've done an online training with us before, where you have both the practice components and the lecture components. So I'll show you this here, a little insider's view. So this was last year's Yin and meditation board here. So when this goes up, you'll have the links to the live calls for our fall quarter here on this page as well. It has some suggested props. You definitely don't need all of these because you can definitely make do with not bolsters, but couch cushions and pillows and blankets in your home for Yin, which is wonderful. So this kind of gives you an overview. And and then you can see there each section. So there's 6 sections here. Each section has a longer asana practice to help integrate both the yin as well as some gentle, accessible vinyasa and the meditation practices. So you can kind of see how they can be used together. I think that's really important because there's a nice interplay of them. We'll talk about how they kind of fit together and can be used together, as well as some shorter practices throughout as well. Then you'll have all the lectures, the Q&A call, and the homework. So here you'll see it. We have, this is the first section. So you do the drop down and you get asana practice, and then you get a recap of the sequencing and all for each one. Then you have your lectures, which in this one includes introductions, and then some of the yin lectures. So there's 6 of them here. And then you have your meditation lectures with Rashmi leading some of those there. And this is kind of like, this first section is the foundations of the course, some more practices and resources, Q&A and homework. And so for each one, it kind of goes through that same thing. Now you also have a live chat board and some resources. And then at the end, a discussion board to post your questions. This one's not live anymore. So there's a Q&A discussion board where you can post questions for the live calls if you can't make it, because we will record it and then you can watch the recording. So if it's not in your time zone, don't worry about it. Actually, that's a great question. I've forgotten when the Yin and meditation. The Yin and meditation is on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So we give you a couple of weeks to get through section 1. We launch, let's see, it's October 1st, I think. So our first call is actually on the 20th of October, which gives you plenty of time to complete section 1 and then show up for our live call. Again, if you can't make that 9 a.m. time, you just post your questions on the discussion board and watch the recording. So you've got lots of in-depth lectures, lots of practices to integrate and really feel the information. You've got Q&A sections, you've got homeworks to all bring it to life. So you can take your time, you can do it over the quarter with us if you like having that motivation, and really integrate it into your experience as well. All right, I've actually gone a little bit over, so I'm going to see if I can answer a few of these questions here. Allison said, I've been reading a bit lately about yin influencing the sinew channels rather than the primary channels or the meridians. Could you comment on this? Yeah, the idea is that, thank you, good question, Allison. It's kind of a detail because for us, it doesn't matter as much, but it does really influence. These sinew channels are what are going right under the skin in that superficial fascia. And some of the newer understanding is because of this fascial research we talked about today, is that it's probably influencing more of those sinew channels. And there's no way to measure that, but based on our understanding in Chinese medicine of the sinew channels running in that superficial fascia, it's described as running between the skin and the muscle layer, that it's influencing more of those. However, keep in mind that those sinew channels then connect into the primary channels. So when we talk about it in this course, for instance, we'll talk about the primary channels because that is what is familiar to us. The sinew channels are not mapped out. They are just running all through that layer. So we talk specifically about the primary channels. So we love hearing your feedback, whether that's on trainings or things you want to hear on the podcast or things you want on social media. It's so important to me as a teacher to provide you guys with some free assets that you can use. And that's kind of the purpose of the podcast, is to provide some free information. But then also for those of you who really want to dig deep, it really requires a lot more information. Like you could see, it takes a little bit just to get into the nuts and bolts of it. And so we provide those full-length courses for people who really want some deep investigation and study. So we're always trying our best to evolve and make your experience on our site better and provide you with some resources. So we love your feedback. Let us know. You can comment on social media or on Yoga Medicine Online. We've got commenting on the classes or on the podcast, wherever you like, emails. And there's a feedback section at the end of the course. So All right. Well, I got through all the Q&A questions. I know that there are always some in the chat, but we've already gone about 20 minutes over. So I hope that gives you some information. If you came late, I'm assuming the people who posted questions in the chat probably came late. So if you watch the recording, I think you might find some answers to some of those questions in there. I think there's only a couple. But hopefully that gives you some valuable resources. Know that there's always going to still be some questions. And I'm sure there are questions in there that I can't answer. Like there's a lot we don't know about fibromyalgia and multiple sclerosis. We definitely don't have studies on yin yoga. And what I didn't mention actually is that what I'm doing is taking the stretching research and applying it to yin yoga. So what we don't really have is specific information on yin yoga, which to me is really about that length, that 5-minute duration, which is different than a lot of other static stretching modalities. So there's a lot we don't know, and we need to be okay living in the mystery, finding ways to apply this safely to the individual that we're working with. So gently, safely, building over time, and knowing that there are a lot of things that we just don't know yet. So I hope you have a fun time experimenting. I love a yin practice. I found it very helpful for myself, my patients, my students, and I find it to be a really valuable resource for a lot of reasons. And I hope you enjoy it as well. And I hope that this was helpful. Thank you guys for attending. I hope you have a great day wherever you are. And I hope to see you somewhere sometime soon, whether that's online or maybe one day in person. Thank you guys. Enjoy your day.